The lurch and groan of the stagecoach was the only language Alara had understood for weeks. Now, as the wheels ground to a final, dusty halt, a profound and terrible silence fell. The driver's gruff call of Redemption Gulch was swallowed by a heat so thick it felt like a blanket woven from shimmering glass. Through the grimy window, the world was a warped and swimming thing, a fever dream painted in shades of ochre and rust. She waited a moment, gathering the frayed edges of her courage. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. This was it, the end of the line. The place she had run to, sight unseen, a name on a piece of paper that promised a new life, or at least an escape from the old one. She prayed it was far enough. Boston was a world away, a lifetime away, but its ghosts had long shadows, and she feared they might stretch even across this sun-scoured continent. Taking a shallow breath that tasted of grit, she pushed open the flimsy door and stepped down. The heat struck her with the force of a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. It was a dry, oppressive furnace that seemed to radiate from the very ground, from the pale, merciless sky, from the air itself. Fine red dust, the consistency of flour, immediately began to settle on her dark traveling dress, turning the black fabric a dull, tired brown. It coated her eyelashes and settled on her tongue. Her gaze swept over the landscape, and a knot of cold terror tightened in her stomach. This was not a place of redemption. It was a place of endings. The ground was cracked and bare, split open like a wound that would not heal. Skeletal saguaro cacti reached toward the sky like the gnarled hands of supplicants whose prayers had long gone unanswered. Sun-bleached bones of some unfortunate creature, a cow perhaps, were scattered near the road, picked clean and looking as ancient and permanent as the rocks. The entire world seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for a drop of water that would never come. This land was not indifferent. It felt actively hostile, a vast and brutal entity that starved and baked and scoured all life from its surface. She clutched the handle of her small, worn valise, her knuckles white. It was all she had left of the world she knew, and in this alien landscape, it felt less like luggage and more like a shield. Redemption. Gulch was little more than a single, wide street carved through the dust. A few weathered, false-fronted buildings stood hunched against the glare, a general store, a cantina with swinging doors that offered no respite from the heat, and a blacksmith's forge from which the rhythmic clang of a hammer on steel was the only sign of life. As she stood there, a solitary figure in a dark dress, the hammering stopped. A thick, sweaty man emerged from the smithy's shadows, wiping his brow with the back of a hand, his eyes immediately locking onto her. On the porch of the cantina, two old men in faded shirts stopped their whittling and stared, their expressions as blank and hard as sun-baked clay. A woman shaking a rug out of a second-story window paused, the rug held motionless, her gaze sharp and appraising. The silence on the street was no longer empty. It was full of questions, of a weary and ingrained suspicion. These were people long embattled by hardship, their faces etched with the story of drought and disappointment. They did not see a newcomer. They saw a threat, or perhaps just a fool. Ilara's skin prickled under the weight of their collective gaze. She felt like an actress who had wandered onto the wrong stage, in the middle of a play she did not know. She forced her feet to move, the dust puffing up around her worn boots. She approached the general store, its windows so clouded with dust it was impossible to see inside. The whispers started behind her, a dry, rustling sound like snakes in the dead grass. She could not make out the words, but the tone was clear. Judgment, curiosity, contempt. She cleared her throat, her voice emerging as a small, tight thing. "Pardon me," she said to the figures on the cantina porch. "I am looking for Caleb Blackwood." The name fell into the heat and died. The old men did not answer. One of them spat a brown stream of tobacco juice into the dust, his eyes never leaving her face. The silence that followed was different from before. It was heavier, colder, laced with something that felt like a shared, grim secret. Finally, The door to the general store creaked open. A thin man with a graying mustache and a stained apron stepped out. His eyes, small and shrewd, took in every detail of her appearance, from her city-made dress to the exhaustion clinging to her like a second skin. This must be Henderson, the store owner, the man who had facilitated the correspondence. "You'll be the mail-order bride, then," he stated. It was not a question. "Yes," Alara managed. "Could you tell me where I might find Mr. Blackwood?" Henderson's expression was a difficult thing to read, a sour mixture of pity and scorn. He looked at her as if she were a lamb who had willingly paid for passage to the slaughterhouse. He did not speak, but merely lifted a curt hand and pointed, not towards a prosperous ranch on the horizon, but towards the far edge of the desolate town, where the cracked earth sloped down to the ghost of a riverbed. Then he turned and went back inside, the creak of the door closing like a final verdict. She followed the direction of his pointed finger, her valise growing heavier with every step. The riverbed was a wide, sandy scar on the landscape, littered with smooth, pale stones and the desiccated corpses of ancient cottonwood trees. And there, in the center of the parched expanse, was a man. He was not at a thriving homestead, not waiting on the porch of a welcoming home. He was in the dry heart of the curse itself, working alone. He was heaving large rocks into place, trying to shore up a section of the riverbank that was crumbling into dust. The labor was immense, futile, and he tackled it with a grim, solitary intensity. As she drew closer, she could see him more clearly, and her breath caught in her throat. He was tall, but lean in the way of a man who has been stripped of all excess by sun and starvation. The sun had weathered his skin to the color of old leather, and his clothes, a simple shirt and worn denim trousers, were patched in a dozen places. His hands, wrapped around a large, jagged stone, were not the hands of a gentleman. They were tools, calloused and scarred, the knuckles swollen, the fingers thick with strength. He moved with a slow, powerful economy, his muscles cording in his back and arms as he lifted and set another rock into place. When he finally straightened and turned, wiping a sheen of sweat from his brow with his forearm, she saw his face. It was a mask of hard angles and planes, a face carved by the wind and the sun, but his eyes, when they met hers, were a startling, piercing blue. They were the color of a winter sky, clear and cold, and they held a weariness so profound it seemed to sink into his very bones. He stared at her for a long moment, his blue eyes taking her in without a flicker of welcome or surprise. She was a parcel that had been ordered and had now, finally, arrived. "You are Alara?" he asked. His voice was a low rasp, dry as the riverbed itself. "Yes, and you are Caleb Blackwood." He gave a short, curt nod, as if confirming a piece of cargo on a manifest. There was no warmth, no smile, no greeting for the woman who had traveled 2,000 miles to be his bride. He gestured with his head towards a rickety wagon standing nearby, its wood bleached gray by the sun. "Get in the wagon," he said, and then he turned back to his rocks. His audience with her apparently concluded. The journey to his ranch was conducted in a silence as vast and empty as the land they traveled through. The only sounds were the rhythmic squeak of the wagon wheels and the tired plodding of the two thin mules that pulled them. Alara sat stiffly on the hard wooden bench, her hands clasped tightly around the handle of her valise. She watched him, but he never looked at her. His gaze was fixed on the horizon, his jaw set, his expression unreadable. She turned her attention to the land that was to be her new home, and her heart sank with every turn of the wheels. It was a panorama of failure. The fields they passed were not fallow, they were dead. The earth was a mosaic of deep, sun-baked cracks, a place where nothing grew but despair. They passed a small herd of cattle, and they were skeletal things, their ribs starkly visible beneath their hides, their heads hanging low as they picked listlessly at the sparse, brown weeds. This was not a ranch, it was a boneyard. The ranch house, when it finally came into view, did little to lift her spirits. It was a small, stark wooden structure, unpainted and unforgiving in its simplicity. It was clean. She would give it that. There was a severe, scrubbed tidiness about it. But it was threadbare. A home stripped down to the bare necessities of survival. A lone, dead tree stood beside it, its branches like black veins against the pale sky. The wind, which had been a constant presence, seemed to gather itself here, whistling through the eaves of the small house with a constant, mournful sound. Now she understood the townspeople's whispers. This was the heart of the Blackwood curse, a place where life itself seemed to wither and turn to dust. Inside, the house was as grim as the exterior. A main room served as kitchen and living space, furnished with a rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, and a cold iron stove. Everything was scoured clean but worn thin with use and time. Their first meal together was eaten in a silence so thick Alara felt she might choke on it. It was not a peaceful silence, but one heavy with unspoken questions, hardened grief, and a palpable exhaustion that radiated from the man sitting across from her. He placed a tin plate of beans and a piece of dry cornbread in front of her without a word. She tried, once, to break the quiet. "The journey was very long," she said, her voice sounding unnaturally loud in the small room. "I imagine," he replied, not looking up from his plate. Another attempt. "Mr. Henderson at the store seemed, well, he pointed me in your direction. He would—" His single-word answers were walls, and she had no strength left to try and climb them. She ate her food, the beans tasting of salt and dust. Caleb's exhaustion was a living presence at the table. It was in the slump of his broad shoulders, in the slow, deliberate way he lifted his spoon, in the deep lines etched around his weary eyes. He seemed to carry the weight of the dying land, the heat of the relentless sun, and the memory of 1,000 failed hopes squarely upon his back. When the meal was over, he rose. "Your room is here," he said, gesturing to a closed door. He did not open it for her, but simply turned and walked out the front door, back into the fading light, presumably to continue some endless, grueling chore. She pushed the door open. The room was little more than a cell, a narrow bed with a thin, patched quilt, a small washstand with a chipped porcelain bowl and pitcher, and a single small window that looked out onto the dead fields. The finality of her situation settled over her with a crushing weight. She had fled a prison of silk and whispers in Boston, a cage gilded with wealth and menace. She had exchanged it for this, a prison of dust and silence. Alone in her small room, with the mournful wind as her only companion, Ilara finally opened her valise. Her few belongings seemed foreign and fragile here, a spare dress of dark wool, a small collection of books, a brush and comb. At the very bottom, wrapped in a layer of linen, was a small, velvet-lined box. Her fingers trembled as she opened it. Inside lay a single, ornate silver locket, intricately carved with forget-me-nots. Beside it was a folded letter, the paper yellowed and brittle with age. She touched the cool metal of the locket for a moment, a wave of cold sorrow washing over her. Then, with furtive, fearful movements, she knelt and found a loose floorboard beneath the bed. She lifted it, placed the box into the dark space below, and carefully replaced the board. Her actions were those of a fugitive, of someone who knew that even in the most desolate corners of the world, the past could still be found. As she straightened up, a fragment of memory, sharp as a shard of glass, cut through her thoughts, the cloying scent of expensive cologne, the glint of gaslight on a silk waistcoat, and a man's voice, smooth as velvet but with the cold menace of steel beneath it, whispering a threat so vile it had sent her running into the arms of this barren wilderness. She shuddered, pulling the thin blanket from the bed and wrapping it tightly around her shoulders. The desert wind cried around the corners of the house, and for a moment it sounded like a name being called, a mournful accusation she could never truly escape. He woke her before the sun had even hinted at its arrival, a sharp rap on her door, and his voice, rough and impersonal. Time to work. The day that followed was a blur of relentless alien labor, The list of chores was endless. She was to mend a pile of his worn clothing, a task for which her fingers, accustomed to fine needlepoint, were surprisingly clumsy on the rough denim. She was tasked with tending the sad little vegetable patch behind the house, a collection of withered plants clinging desperately to life in the poor soil. And she was to draw water from the well. The well was the cruelest joke of all. It was nearly dry. Each turn of the crank was a struggle, and it produced a bucket that was barely a quarter full of brackish, metallic-tasting water. Her hands, soft from a life of reading books and serving tea, were clumsy and weak. By midday, they were red and raw. By late afternoon, they had blistered. Caleb watched her struggles with an unnerving stillness. He would appear without a sound, standing silently as she fumbled with a needle or wrestled with the well crank. He was not cruel. He offered no insults, no sharp words. But his patience was a thin, brittle thing, born of the endless, grinding urgency of survival. There was no time for weakness here. He would correct her mistakes with rough, impersonal gestures. When she held the axe incorrectly to split the kindling, he came up behind her, took her hands in his own, and repositioned them on the handle. His touch was a fleeting, shocking warmth on her skin, a brief connection in a world of silence and distance. It was over in a second, but the feeling of his calloused palms against hers lingered, a strange and unsettling ember. Most of his day, however, was spent in a place that drew Ilara's gaze with a kind of morbid fascination. A few hundred yards from the house, in the middle of a barren field, was a deep, wide pit. From dawn until the last light failed, Caleb was in that pit, digging. He was digging a new well, by hand, a task so monumental and seemingly hopeless that it bordered on madness. From the porch of the small house, she watched him. He was a lone figure battling the unforgiving earth. He worked with a silent, desperate fury, his muscles straining, his body quickly covered in a sheen of sweat that turned the ever-present dust into a second skin of mud. The rhythmic thud of his pickaxe and the scrape of his shovel were the heartbeat of this dying ranch. She saw that this was not just work for him. It was an obsession. It was an act of defiance, a war waged against his fate, against the curse that hung over his name. And as she watched this grim, silent man in his relentless, almost mad quest, Ilara felt the first, faint flicker of a strange kinship. She recognized the desperation in the set of his shoulders. It was the same desperation that had propelled her across a continent. He was a soul pushed to the very edge, fighting with his last ounce of strength against a force that was determined to crush him. And in that shared desperation, in that silent battle for survival, she felt a sliver of understanding, a fragile thread connecting her own broken past to his barren present. The days bled into weeks, each one a copy of the last, baked in the same relentless sun and scoured by the same restless wind. The initial shock of Ilara's arrival hardened, like clay left in a kiln, into a quiet and enduring resilience. Her body, once accustomed to the soft confines of Boston society, was remade by the unforgiving landscape. The sun did not burn her skin so much as it stained it, darkening it to a healthy bronze that would have scandalized the pale ladies of the East. Her hands, which had once bled from the blisters of her first day's work, became tough and calloused, the skin thickening into a protective layer that no longer felt the sting of the well rope or the bite of a splinter. A wiry strength settled into her limbs, replacing the soft roundness of her former life. She learned to swing an axe without flinching, to carry 2 heavy buckets of water without stumbling, to coax life from the dry soil with a patience she never knew she possessed. Her initial clumsiness gave way to a grim competence. She moved through the chores with a practiced rhythm, her mind often drifting as her body worked, but the physical hardship was a dull ache compared to the sharp, piercing pang of her loneliness. It was a constant companion, as profound and empty as the vast, star-dusted desert sky at night, in the crushing silence of the ranch, broken only by the wind and the distant cry of a coyote. She was forced to turn inward. There, in the quiet chambers of her own heart, she discovered a deep, hidden well of strength. It was a strength forged in the fires of shame and loss, a resilience she had been forced to cultivate in order to survive the ruin of her life in Boston, here, in this new wilderness. It was the only thing that kept her from shattering. Once a month, Caleb would hitch the mules to the wagon for a rare trip into Redemption Gulch for meager supplies. On the third of these trips, he allowed her to accompany him, a silent concession that she was now a permanent fixture of his bleak existence. The experience was a fresh kind of torment. As she walked into Henderson's general store, a wave of cold silence fell over the room. Two women who had been chatting by a barrel of pickles turned their backs to her, their shoulders forming a wall of calico and judgment. A group of children playing near the door stopped, and one small, grubby boy pointed a finger at her, his voice a loud whisper that carried through the entire store. "That's her, the cursed bride." Henderson served her with a cold, perfunctory air, his eyes holding a judgment that made her feel like a specimen under glass. He spoke only when necessary, tallying the cost of flour, salt, and beans, his lips a thin, disapproving line. While Caleb was outside loading their supplies, Elara lingered near a shelf of sewing notions, pretending to examine a spool of thread. It was then that she overheard the conversation. Two old-timers speaking in low rumbles not meant for her ears. "It's a fool thing, him bringing another woman out to that place," the first one said, his voice a dry rasp. "He's tempting fate is what he's doing," the second replied, spitting into a nearby cuspidor. "The Blackwood curse ain't satisfied yet. Took his wife, took his boy, it'll take this one too." "Poor Lena," the first man sighed. "Pretty thing. She was full of life, and little Samuel, just a babe, burned right up, the both of them. Fever came on so swift, the doc said there was nothing to be done. It's the land. I tell you, that land is poisoned. Caleb should have left it long ago. He's as stubborn as the rock he's trying to dig through. Thinks he can beat it, but you can't beat a curse. And now he's gone and tied this poor creature to it. She's either a fool or she's running from something awful to end up here." Elara felt the blood drain from her face. She turned and walked stiffly from the store, the old men's words echoing in her mind. Lena, Samuel, a wife and a son, consumed by the very land she now called home. The town didn't just pity Caleb, they blamed him. And by marrying him, she had willingly draped herself in the shroud of his curse, becoming another ill omen in their weary, superstitious eyes. Days later, while engaged in the thankless task of trying to beat the dust out of the few thin rugs in the house, Elara decided to wage a war on the grime that had settled into every corner. She scrubbed and swept with a fury, the physical labor a welcome distraction from the town's whispers. In Caleb's small, Spartan bedroom, a room she had never entered, she found a bedside table coated in a thick layer of dust. As she wiped it down, her rag caught on the handle of a small drawer. She pulled, but it was stuck fast. Driven by a sudden, inexplicable curiosity, she worked at it, wiggling it back and forth until, with a sharp crack, it gave way. Inside, nestled in the dark, lay two objects. The first was a small, intricately carved wooden bird, its head cocked in a cheerful, lifelike pose. It was a meadowlark, carved with such skill and tenderness that she could almost hear its song. The wood was worn smooth in places, as if it had been held and cherished by a small hand. Beside it lay a faded ribbon of pale blue silk. Elara picked up the wooden bird, its weight surprisingly solid in her palm. These objects were so full of a lost tenderness that they made her heart ache. They did not belong in this house of silence and hardship. They were relics from another time, another life. She could see Caleb, his large, calloused hands so impossibly gentle, carving this delicate creature for his son, Samuel. She could see the blue ribbon tied in his wife's hair, a splash of color and softness in this harsh, monochromatic world. For the first time, she saw him not as the grim, silent rancher who was her husband in name only, but as a man who had once loved so deeply that the loss of it had hollowed him out, leaving only this shell of grief and obsession. He wasn't just a man battling the land. He was a man haunted by the ghosts of a life that had been stolen from him. This discovery didn't excuse his coldness, but it explained it. It deeply humanized him, planting a fragile seed of empathy in the barren soil of her own loneliness. She gently placed the items back in the drawer and pushed it closed, feeling like an intruder who had stumbled upon a sacred grave. Her nights, once a refuge, became a new kind of prison. The ghosts of Boston grew bolder in the desert darkness. The fragmented flashbacks that had plagued her upon her arrival began to coalesce into a more detailed and disturbing narrative. She would lie awake, staring at the moonlight on the floor, and see it all again. She saw herself as she had been, an educated companion to a wealthy Boston dowager, a life of quiet respectability and intellectual pursuits. And she saw him, Silas Blackwood, the dowager's nephew. He was handsome, charming, and respected, a pillar of Boston society. At first, his pursuit was flattering. He brought her flowers, quoted poetry, and spoke to her as an intellectual equal. But his charm was a mask, a beautiful facade hiding a chilling possessiveness. When she gently but firmly rejected his advances, explaining that her position and her heart were not for sale, his attention curdled into obsession. The flowers were replaced by unwelcome, extravagant gifts she could not refuse without offending his powerful aunt. The poetry was replaced by coercion, his words twisting her polite refusals into coy games of seduction. Her younger brother, James, a bright and fiery university student, saw the truth. He saw the predator behind the gentleman's smile. He tried to intervene, to help her find a way to escape Silas's ever-tightening net. The final, terrible memory always came with the smell of rain on cobblestones and the sound of horses. James had confronted Silas on a dark street, angry words escalating into a confrontation. Silas, in a fit of rage at being defied, had shoved James. It was a simple, violent act, but it sent her brother stumbling backward, off the curb and directly into the path of an oncoming carriage. The aftermath was even more horrific. Silas, with his wealth and influence, twisted the narrative into a weapon. He painted Alara as a shameless seductress who had played two men against each other. He whispered to his society friends that she had driven her own brother to a reckless, tragic death. The whispers became headlines in the scandal sheets. She was publicly shamed, branded, and ruined. She had not only lost her brother, she had been accused of causing his death by the very man who had killed him. Fleeing was not a choice. It was the only option left. Caleb's own struggle with the earth intensified. His desperation took on a frantic, dangerous edge. One afternoon, as Alara was hanging laundry, a deep rumble echoed from the direction of the pit, followed by a crash and a plume of dust. She ran, her heart seizing with terror, to find that a section of the pit wall had collapsed. A slide of rock and earth had partially buried the spot where Caleb had been working. For a few agonizing seconds, she could not see him. Then he emerged from the dust, coughing and bruised, a long gash on his forearm, but alive. He waved away her frightened cry, his face a mask of grim fury at the setback. He worked from before dawn until long after the sun had set, fueled by a desperation that now seemed to border on madness. He grew leaner, the muscles in his back and arms standing out like ropes, and the lines of strain on his face deepened until he looked 10 years older than he had when she arrived. A profound fear for his safety began to take root in Alara's heart. He was killing himself, sacrificing his body to this unforgiving hole in the ground. She began to act. Each morning, before he went to the pit, she would fill a canteen with the freshest water from the well and wrap a piece of cornbread in a cloth. She would leave it on a flat rock at the edge of the pit, a small, anonymous gesture of care. She would be gone before he emerged from the house. He never acknowledged the offerings, never mentioned them, but every evening, when she went to retrieve the canteen, it was empty, and the bread was gone. The punishing heat of late summer finally did what the collapsing earth could not. Alara was mending one of his shirts on the porch, seeking a sliver of shade, when she realized the rhythmic thud of his pickaxe had stopped. The sudden silence was unnerving. She waited a minute, then another. A prickle of unease ran down her spine. She walked towards the pit, calling his name. There was no answer. At the edge, she looked down. He was not in the hole. She scanned the area, and then she saw him, collapsed in the merciless sun a few feet from the lip of the pit. He was lying face down in the dust, utterly still. A primal fear, cold and sharp, gripped her. She scrambled down the rocky slope and knelt beside him. She rolled him over. His face was flushed a dangerous red. His lips were cracked and white, and his breathing was terrifyingly shallow. She pressed her fingers to his neck and felt a faint, thready pulse, heat stroke and dehydration. The land had finally struck him down. Without a second thought, she acted. She hooked her arms under his, and with a surge of adrenaline and the wiry strength she had earned through weeks of hard labor, she began to drag him. He was a dead weight, but she gritted her teeth, her feet slipping in the dust as she pulled him, inch by agonizing inch, back towards the relative cool of the house. For the next day and night, she tended to him. The roles were utterly reversed. The grim, self-sufficient rancher was as helpless as a child, and she, the clumsy mail-order bride, was his protector. She managed to get him to his bed and stripped off his sweat-soaked shirt. She bathed his feverish skin with rags dipped in cool water, watching vigilantly as his temperature slowly, stubbornly began to fall. She coaxed sips of water between his cracked lips, a drop at a time, praying he would swallow. In this raw and intimate state, he was a different man. Stripped of his stoic armor of silence and ceaseless labor, she saw the deep vulnerability he hid from the world. She saw the scars on his back and the profound exhaustion that had settled into his very bones. She saw the man who had lost a wife and child, the man the town called cursed, the man who was now completely at her mercy. And she felt not revulsion or pity, but a fierce, protective tenderness. Late that night, as she sat in a chair by his bed, his breathing finally deepening into a more stable rhythm, his eyes fluttered open. They were unfocused, clouded with delirium. He looked at Alara, but his gaze seemed to look straight through her, to someone else who was not there. A whisper escaped his lips, a voice thick with a guilt so raw it was like an open wound. "Lena," he breathed. "I'm sorry. I should have saved you. I'm so sorry." The words were a knife in Alara's heart. She sat frozen, the wet cloth clutched in her hand, as his eyes slipped closed again. In that moment, she understood everything. His grief was not a memory. It was not a scar. It was a raw, gaping wound that he lived with every single day. His battle with the earth was not just for water. It was an act of penance, a desperate attempt to atone for a sin he believed was his own. He finally woke near dawn, his mind clear but his body weak. He blinked slowly, taking in the room, and then his eyes settled on her, slumped and exhausted in the chair beside him. The wall was back up in his eyes, the stoic mask settling back into place. But it was thinner now, more fragile. He looked at her, truly saw her, not as a mail-order bride, not as a feature of the landscape, but as the person who had sat with him through the darkness. For the first time since she had arrived, he spoke to her, his voice a hoarse rasp, and uttered two simple words that felt as monumental as a mountain. "Thank you." An invisible thread, spun from shared hardship and a moment of profound vulnerability, had been spun between them. It was fragile, easily broken, but it was real. Caleb's recovery was a slow and quiet affair. He did not speak of the night she had saved him, nor did she. Yet, something fundamental had been altered between them, as if a great weight had shifted in the foundations of their shared existence. The silence in the small house was different now. It was no longer a heavy, hostile presence, a wall of unspoken resentments. It had become a softer thing, imbued with a new texture of shared awareness. They were two solitary figures who had, for a moment, glimpsed the depths of the other's desolation, and that knowledge lingered in the air between them. He moved with more care around her. When he passed her in the narrow space by the stove, he no longer brushed past as if she were an inanimate object, but paused, giving her room to move. His gaze, which had once been so carefully averted or filled with a flat, consuming weariness, would now occasionally linger on her for a moment. It was a questioning, unreadable expression, as if he were trying to reconcile the memory of the delicate woman who arrived in the dust with the resilient one who had dragged him from the jaws of death. Ilara, in turn, found herself watching him not with fear, but with a growing, complicated compassion. When she saw him returning from the pit at dusk, his shoulders slumped with an exhaustion that went bone deep. Her heart no longer felt the cold knot of terror, but a strange, protective ache. She saw the ghost of the man he had been, the husband and father who had once known tenderness, and she began to understand the furious, desperate grief that drove him. They were like two solitary planets that had been spinning in their own lonely orbits. And now, finally, their paths were beginning to converge, drawn together by the gravity of shared hardship. The sky, which for months had been a merciless, cloudless canvas of searing blue, began to change. One afternoon, the western horizon began to bruise with dark, angry clouds, their bellies the color of slate. A strange, electric stillness fell over the land. The birds fell silent, and the ceaseless wind seemed to hold its breath. Hope, a dangerous and unfamiliar emotion, fluttered in Ilara's chest. Rain. The impossible promise of it hung in the thick, heavy air. But it was a cruel trick of the desert. As the afternoon bled into a bruised and ominous twilight, a dry thunderstorm rolled in. It brought no life-giving water, only a violent, chaotic wind that tore at the small ranch house, rattling the windows in their frames and sending dust devils dancing across the dead fields. Great, jagged forks of lightning tore across the sky, illuminating the bleak landscape in stark, instantaneous flashes of white. The thunder that followed was a deep, guttural roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. The storm was a terrifying and magnificent display of nature's power, but it was a power squandered, a promise broken. It was a mockery, promising relief and delivering only danger. Ilara stood at the small window, watching the violent, waterless spectacle, a profound disappointment settling in her heart. Caleb stood on the porch, a tall, dark silhouette against the strobing sky, his face turned upward as if in defiance. Then it happened. A bolt of lightning, thicker and brighter than the rest, arced across the sky with a sound like tearing silk. It did not strike the distant mountains, but came down, impossibly close, with a deafening crack that vibrated through the soles of Ilara's feet. It struck a massive, dead mesquite tree that stood at the edge of their property, in the middle of the last patch of brown, parched grazing land that had survived the drought. For a heartbeat, there was nothing. Then, a single hungry orange flower of flame bloomed at the base of the tree. The wind, which had been a torment, now became an accomplice to disaster. It fanned the small flame, which leaped into the tinder dry grass. The parched grass ignited instantly, not as a creeping fire, but as an explosive sheet of flame. A wall of roiling orange, driven by the gale-force wind, began to race across the field, directly towards the ranch house and the barn where their two thin mules were sheltered. The moment was pure chaos and terror, the roar of the fire now louder than the thunder. All the awkwardness and the fragile, unspoken tenderness that had grown between them was incinerated in the furnace of that immediate existential threat. Caleb's weariness, his grief, his obsession, it all vanished, burned away and replaced by a focused, primal intensity. He spun around, his blue eyes blazing with a fire of their own. "The well!" he shouted over the roar, his voice a raw command. "Get the sacks! Soak them! Now! Ilara, move!" She did not hesitate. Without a second's thought, she ran, her skirts flying towards the well. Caleb was already in the barn, emerging a moment later with a shovel and a heavy pickaxe. All the distance between them, all the silence, was gone. They were no longer a rancher and his mail-order bride. They were two humans fighting for their shared existence against an enemy that meant to consume everything they had. He battled the flames with the shovel, his movements a blur of desperate energy. He was not trying to put the fire out. It was too large, too fast. He was digging a fire break, a frantic, wide trench in the hard-packed earth, trying to create a barrier of bare dirt that the flames could not cross. The work was brutal, punishing. The muscles in his back and shoulders bunched and strained as he tore at the unyielding ground. Ilara, meanwhile, worked the well crank with a speed and strength she had never possessed before. The water level was dangerously low, and each bucket she drew was a precious, life-saving resource. She dragged the heavy burlap sacks to the trough, soaking them in the murky water until they were heavy and dripping. Then, she ran towards the fire line, her lungs burning from the smoke, the heat a physical blow against her skin. She beat at the smaller, encroaching flames with the wet sacks, the canvas hissing and steaming as it met the fire. The heat was suffocating, a solid wall that seemed to steal the air from her lungs. The smoke, thick and acrid, blinded her, stinging her eyes until tears streamed down her soot-stained cheeks. The roar of the fire was a deafening, all-consuming presence, a hungry beast devouring their world. They worked as a desperate, unified team. When he needed a new shovel, she was there with it. When a flaming ember leaped across his firebreak, she was there to beat it out with a soaked sack. They did not speak, for there was no breath for words. Their communication was in a shared glance, a pointed finger, a desperate nod. They were a frantic, seamless machine, powered by adrenaline and the sheer will to survive. Hours later, as the wind finally began to die down and the fire, having consumed all the available fuel, burned itself out, they collapsed. They fell to the earth at the edge of the smoldering, blackened ground, their bodies screaming with an exhaustion so profound it felt like a death. They were covered from head to toe in soot and grime. Their clothes were singed, their hair matted with ash. They had saved the house and the barn, but the pasture, their last hope for their skeletal cattle, was a black, smoking ruin. They sat in the eerie, pre-dawn silence, the only light coming from the dying red glow of the embers that dotted the blackened field like 1,000 malevolent eyes. Caleb wordlessly held out a canteen, and she took it, her hand trembling. They passed it back and forth, sharing the last of their precious water, the metallic taste a balm to their raw, parched throats. The shared trauma and the raw, stripping power of their exhaustion had burned away all their remaining defenses. There was nothing left to hide behind. Staring out at the utter devastation, the complete ruin of his last viable asset, Caleb finally broke the long silence of his soul. His voice was rough, hollowed out by grief and smoke, a sound that seemed to be scraped from the very bottom of his being. "It was a fever," he began, his gaze fixed on the smoking desolation. "It came on so fast. One day, Lena was humming in the kitchen, and Samuel was chasing a lizard in the yard. The next they were burning." He swallowed hard, the sound raw and painful. "Their skin was so hot. I put cool cloths on them, just like you did for me, but it did nothing. The fever just consumed them." He paused, and Ilara remained utterly still, listening, her heart aching with the weight of his guilt. The doctor was in Prescott, a full day's ride. If you kill the horse getting there, I knew I wouldn't make it in time. I just sat there, between their beds, changing the cloths, trying to get them to drink. I watched them die. Ilara, I watched my wife and my son slip away, and I couldn't do a single thing to stop it. His voice cracked. After the funeral, the whispers started. Henderson, the others. They said I'd brought them here to die, that this land was cursed, and I was a fool to think I could make a life on it. They said I killed them, just as sure as if I'd held a pistol to their heads. He finally turned to look at her, and in the faint, glowing light of the embers, she could see the sheen of unshed tears in his startlingly blue eyes. The sight was so shocking, so utterly at odds with the stoic, iron-willed man she knew, that it stole her breath. He confessed his deepest, most agonizing secret, the words torn from him in a ragged whisper. Sometimes, a part of me believes them. A part of me thinks that they're right, that I am the curse, that everything I touch turns to dust. The confession hung in the smoky air between them, a thing of terrible, tragic weight. His pain was so profound, so elemental, that it momentarily eclipsed her own. The shame of Boston, the loss of her brother. It was all a complicated, man-made tragedy. His was a primal grief, a battle against God and the earth itself. When he finished, the silence was thick with his pain. She searched for words, but knew that platitudes would be an insult. So she found her own truth, a truth forged in the crucible of her own suffering, and offered it to him. "The land isn't cursed, Caleb," she said softly, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her own heart. Her gaze met his, holding it. "Sometimes the curse is just a memory we can't escape, a story someone told us about ourselves, a story we start to believe." In that moment, she was not just offering him comfort. She was articulating the very nature of her own torment, the public shame that Silas had woven into a narrative to destroy her. She was telling him that she understood. He stared at her, his expression one of stunned surprise. He had expected pity, perhaps, or a quiet withdrawal. He had not expected this sudden, sharp ray of understanding, this wisdom from a woman he had treated as little more than a beast of burden, moved by her empathy, by the profound truth in her simple words. He slowly, tentatively, reached out. His calloused, soot-stained thumb came up and gently brushed a streak of ash from her cheek. The touch was reverent, almost fearful, as if he were touching something impossibly fragile, a jolt of pure electricity, of a power far greater than the lightning that had started the fire, shot through both of them. It was a gesture of profound intimacy, a silent acknowledgement that spoke more than words ever could. Their eyes locked, and in that shared gaze, in the reflection of the dying embers, they saw each other for the first time. They saw the reflection of their own brokenness, their own loneliness, and in the depths of that shared ruin, a nascent, terrifying hope began to stir. His gaze shifted from her face, moving across the blackened field to the pit, the monument to his desperate obsession. "The well," he said, his voice raspy with a new, unshakable resolve. "We have to go deeper. It's the only way." Ilara heard the double meaning with perfect, ringing clarity. To survive this land, they had to dig deeper into the unforgiving earth for water, and to survive their lives, to heal their shattered souls, they had to dig deeper into their own pain, past the grief and the shame. She held his gaze and gave a single, slow nod. It was not an agreement. It was a vow, a silent promise passing between them in the smoky, gray light of the dawn. The fire forged a new world on the Blackwood Ranch. The blackened, smoking field was a scar on the land, a constant reminder of their shared trial and the fragile victory they had won. In its aftermath, a new reality took root. Ilara was no longer just the housekeeper, the mail-order bride occupying a silent corner of Caleb's life. She was a partner. The vow that had passed between them in the smoky dawn was not spoken aloud, but it was honored every day in their shared labor. Her days now began and ended at the pit. She was the one who turned the handle of the rickety windlass, lowering empty buckets into the ever-deepening darkness and hoisting them back up, heavy with rock and dirt. She learned the sharp, metallic smell of the grindstone as she sharpened the blunted edges of the pickaxes and shovel heads. She helped him clear debris after small rock slides, her smaller frame able to navigate the tighter spaces. Their work together fell into a rhythm, an efficient and largely unspoken communication born of shared purpose. She knew by the angle of his shoulders when he was growing tired, by the sound of his shovel hitting a new type of rock that he needed a different tool. He, in turn, learned the limits of her strength, never asking her to lift more than she could handle, always ensuring the rope was secure before she took the strain. In the quiet spaces of this shared toil, small moments of tenderness began to surface, as delicate and unexpected as wildflowers in the desert. One evening, as she was mending a tear in her own worn dress, She found a fresh needle and a spool of dark thread placed on the small table beside her chair. She knew it was from him, a silent acknowledgement of her needs, purchased on his last solitary trip to town. Another time. She began saving a portion of their meager daily rations of beans and corn, combining them to make him a slightly more substantial evening meal every few days. He never commented on the larger portion, but she saw the way his eyes lingered on his plate for a moment before he ate, and she knew he understood the sacrifice it represented. These small, quiet gestures became the language of their growing affection, a language more potent and true than any words could have been. This fragile peace, cultivated in dust and sweat and silence, was shattered by the arrival of a serpent in their barren Eden. He did not come like a thief in the night, but in a gleaming black private coach that kicked up a cloud of dust and drew the stares of the entire population of Redemption Gulch. A man stepped out, handsome and impeccably dressed in a fine suit of Eastern tweed, his boots polished to a high shine. He moved with an easy confidence that was utterly alien to this land of hard-bitten, weary survivors. He introduced himself as Silas Blackwood, a wealthy investor from Boston, interested in the potential of the region. His charm was a well-honed weapon. He bought rounds of whiskey at the cantina, his voice a smooth and cultured balm in the rough, dusty saloon. He spoke of bringing prosperity to the valley, of new irrigation techniques and railroad spurs, and the town's influential figures, Henderson, the store owner, the smithy, the old ranchers whose lands were as parched as Caleb's, listened with a desperate, hungry hope. In a town starved for good news, Silas was a banquet. Ilara was in town for supplies, a trip she now made alone with the wagon, a sign of Caleb's growing trust. She was just leaving Henderson's store, her mind on the dwindling supply of flour. When she saw him, he was standing on the porch of the cantina, holding a glass of whiskey, a circle of admiring townsmen hanging on his every word. The sight of him was not a memory, it was a physical blow. The air rushed from her lungs, and the blood froze in her veins. The dusty street of Redemption Gulch dissolved, replaced for a sickening moment by the gaslit, rain-slicked cobblestones of Boston, all the terror she thought she had outrun, all the shame she had tried to bury 2,000 miles away, came rushing back in a suffocating tide. She ducked her head, turning quickly to hurry back to the wagon, praying he had not seen her. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic prisoner, but it was too late. "Ilara, can it truly be you?" His voice, that same smooth, cultured tone that had haunted her nightmares, cut through the dry air. She froze, her back to him, every muscle screaming at her to run. She forced herself to turn slowly. He was smiling, a handsome, predatory smile that did not reach his cold, assessing eyes. He excused himself from the circle of men and walked towards her, his polished boots making no sound in the thick dust. "What an extraordinary coincidence," he said, his voice low as he reached her, "to find you in this God-forsaken place." She tried to hide, to shrink into herself, but he cornered her in the narrow, sun-baked alley beside the general store. The moment they were out of the public eye, his charming facade dissolved like sugar in water. The smile vanished, replaced by the cold, possessive glint she knew so well. He was no longer the benevolent investor. He was the predator she had fled. "I have been searching for you," he hissed, his voice a low, furious whisper. He grabbed her arm, his grip surprisingly strong, bruising. "Did you truly think you could disappear from me? I was furious when I discovered you had run. It was a great inconvenience." "Let go of me, Silas," she said, her voice trembling but firm. He laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Oh, I have no intention of letting you go, not now that I have found you. You see, you have led me to exactly what I was looking for." He leaned closer. His cologne, the same scent from her nightmares, filling her senses, choking her. "My associates have conducted certain geological surveys," he murmured, his eyes gleaming with a greedy light. "It seems this entire valley is a worthless dust bowl, with one very notable exception. There is a massive, untapped aquifer, a veritable underground river, lying deep beneath this very land. And its heart, the place where it is most accessible, is right under your new husband's supposedly cursed ranch. He savored the irony. He has been digging for a puddle, Ilara, while sitting on an ocean, and I want it. I will not be denied. The pieces clicked into place with a horrifying clarity. His arrival was no coincidence. He had found her, and in doing so, he had found his prize. He saw the understanding, the terror, dawn on her face, and his smile returned, colder and more cruel than before. He laid out his threat with the chilling precision of a surgeon. "Here is what is going to happen," he said, his grip on her arm tightening. "You are going to convince your monosyllabic brute of a husband to sell me his land. He will sell it to me for a pittance, a fraction of its true worth. You will tell him it is a lost cause, that you cannot bear another day in this hell, that you will leave him if he does not sell." "He will never do that," she whispered, her mind reeling. "Oh, he will," Silas sneered, "because if he does not, I will destroy you. I will tell this puritanical, judgmental little town everything about your past, but I will tell them my version. I will paint you as a whore and a murderess. I will twist the story of your dear brother's death into a sordid tale of your own making, of a lover's quarrel that you orchestrated. I will show them the letters I wrote you, the ones you were foolish enough to keep. They will see a fallen woman, a creature of sin. I will turn Caleb and this entire community against you so completely that they will drive you out into the desert with stones. You will be utterly, completely destroyed. Again." He let go of her arm, and she stumbled back against the rough wood of the store wall. "You have 1 week, Ilara," he said, his voice once again smooth and charming as he adjusted his cuffs. 1 week to break his will. I suggest you get to work." He gave her a final, proprietary smile, then turned and walked back into the sunlight of the main street, once again the picture of a respectable gentleman. Ilara returned to the ranch in a state of numb shock. The journey was a blur. She could not remember the mules finding their own way home. She unhitched them, her movements wooden and automatic, her mind a maelstrom of terror and despair. Her first instinct, primal and overwhelming, was to run, to pack her hidden belongings, her few books and the velvet box with its locket and damning letter, and to disappear again, to melt into the vast, anonymous emptiness of the West. She went to her room, her hands trembling as she knelt and lifted the loose floorboard. The box was still there, a tangible link to the past she could not outrun. She spent the afternoon in a tormented, silent debate with herself. The trauma of her public shaming in Boston replayed in her mind, the whispers, the accusing stares, the headlines in the papers. Silas was right. He had done it once, and he could do it again. These people in Redemption Gulch, with their harsh judgments and their belief in curses, would be fertile ground for his poison. They would believe him without question. They would despise her. But then, through her small window, she saw Caleb. He was at the edge of the pit, his back to her, silhouetted against the setting sun. He was working to repair the windlass. His movements slow and deliberate, his entire being focused on the task. His back, broad and unbowed, was a testament to a stubborn, unbreakable resolve. He was a man who did not run, a man who stood his ground against a hostile world and fought back with nothing but his own 2 hands. She thought of the raw, wounded look in his eyes when he had confessed his deepest fear. She thought of the unexpected, reverent tenderness of his touch as he brushed the ash from her cheek. He had shown her his brokenness, and she had shown him understanding. A fragile trust had been built between them, a trust forged in fire and exhaustion. The thought of betraying that trust, of breaking his will as Silas had commanded, of leaving him to face this new, insidious threat alone, it was a violation more unbearable than facing Silas's lies. She made a decision. It was not a decision born of courage, but of a desperate, unwilling loyalty. She would not run. She would not be Silas's weapon. She would stay, and she would fight. That evening, Caleb found her sitting on the edge of the porch, staring out into the encroaching darkness. She had not lit the lamps. Her hands were clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white, her body rigid with a tension that was almost painful to behold. He knew instantly that something was wrong. He came and sat beside her on the top step, not speaking, not questioning, simply waiting. He sat in the silence with her, a solid, grounding presence in the vast, empty dark. His quiet solidarity, his unspoken offer of support, gave her the courage she needed. "A man from my past is here," she began, her voice a trembling whisper that was nearly lost to the sound of the wind. "He has come to Redemption Gulch." She did not tell him every sordid detail. She could not bring herself to speak of her brother's death, or of the public humiliation she had endured. The shame was still too raw, too deep. But she told him enough. She told him of a powerful, wealthy man in Boston who had wanted to own her, who would not take no for an answer. She told him how this man had hurt her family, and how she had been forced to flee to escape him. And she told him that this man had now come here, to this last refuge, to take it from her. "He knows about the water, Caleb," she whispered, the words tasting like poison. "He wants the land. He threatened to ruin me if I do not help him get it." She finally looked at him, her eyes pleading in the dim light. "I am so sorry. I am so afraid. I have brought this trouble to your door." Throughout her halting, painful confession, Caleb remained utterly silent, his expression unreadable in the deep shadows. When she finished, her voice choked with tears she refused to shed. She braced herself. She expected his judgment, his anger at this complication. The disgust of a man who discovers the woman he has taken into his home comes with such a dangerous and sordid past. Instead, he reached over and took her hand. His grip was not gentle, it was firm, strong, encompassing her smaller hand completely. It was not a gesture of pity, but of possession, of solidarity. "This is your home now, Ilara," he said, his voice low and steady, a bedrock in the shifting sands of her fear. "His fight is with me now." This simple, absolute declaration of loyalty and protection was the one thing she had never expected. It was an unconditional acceptance that asked for no more explanations, that passed no judgment. It shattered the last of her emotional walls, the ones she had so carefully constructed to survive. For the first time since her brother had died, for the first time in years of running and hiding, she felt safe. Overwhelmed by a tidal wave of gratitude and an explosive mixture of fear and a love she had not dared to name, her composure finally broke. The tears she had held back for years, tears of grief and shame and loneliness, streamed down her face in hot, silent tracks. Caleb did not offer clumsy words of comfort. He simply pulled her into an embrace, holding her tightly as she wept, her small, shuddering frame pressed against his hard, solid chest. He held her as the storm of her past finally broke, offering her the silent, unshakable shelter of his strength. Later that night, long after the tears had subsided, Ilara lay in her narrow bed, her mind and body humming with the storm of emotions. The fear of Silas was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was overshadowed by a new, powerful feeling, the fierce, defiant love she felt for the man in the next room, the man who had offered her a home not just on his land, but in his life. Driven by an impulse she did not understand but could not deny, she rose from her bed, in her thin cotton nightgown. She padded silently across the cold wooden floor to his room. The door was slightly ajar. She pushed it open. He was sitting on the edge of his bed, his back to her, his head in his hands. He looked up as she entered, his blue eyes luminous in the moonlight slanting through the window. There were no words. Words were inadequate for the chasm of pain they had both crossed to arrive at this moment. Their coming together was not gentle or romantic in a conventional sense. It was a raw, desperate, and deeply passionate affirmation of life in the face of death and despair. When he pulled her into his arms, it was with a hunger born of years of starvation. When she kissed him, it was with a fierceness that sought to erase the ghosts of the past. It was a furious act of claiming each other against a world that had tried to break them both. in their lovemaking. They found not an escape, but a profound and defiant solace, a sacred ground where the curses and whispers and threats of the outside world could not touch them. They had gone deeper than the fire, deeper than the well. They had gone into the heart of their own pain, and there, in the darkness, they had found each other. The week that followed was a fever dream, a desperate race against the deadline Silas had set. The fragile peace of their new intimacy was burned away by a frantic, shared urgency. There was no more time for quiet moments or tender gestures. Their every waking second was consumed by the desperate quest to go deeper, to reach the water that was their only salvation. Their bond, forged in the quiet aftermath of the fire, was now tempered in the crucible of this final, frantic effort. Caleb made a decision. Hand-digging was too slow. Silas's deadline would come and go before he broke through the deep layers of rock. They needed machinery. They sold the last of their healthy cattle to a passing trader for a pittance. It was not enough. With a look of profound pain, Caleb took his father's prized Winchester rifle from the pegs above the mantelpiece. It was a beautiful weapon, its stock worn smooth with age, the last and most precious heirloom of his family. He sold it without haggling, his face a grim, unreadable mask. The money bought them a monstrous, rickety contraption that called itself a steam-powered drill rig. It was a dangerous and unreliable piece of equipment, a heap of rusting iron, whining gears, and a temperamental boiler that hissed and shuddered like a dying beast. Getting it to the ranch was an ordeal in itself, the mules straining to pull the immense weight, the iron wheels churning the dust. Their days became a grueling, continuous cycle of punishing labor. They woke before the sun to stoke the boiler, feeding it with precious wood until it built up enough steam to turn the heavy iron drill bit. The work was a seamless dance of shared purpose. Caleb, with his greater strength, would guide the heavy, jarring drill, his body absorbing the shuddering vibrations. Ilara became the master of the boiler, learning to read its hisses and groans, feeding the fire with a steady hand, her face perpetually smudged with soot. She operated the windlass, clearing the rock and debris the drill churned up. They worked until their bodies screamed with exhaustion, until their hands were raw and their ears rang with the ceaseless chugging of the engine. In the brief, precious moments when the machine cooled, they would fall asleep in the dust beside it, only to wake and begin again. Their shared resolve was a silent thing, mirrored in the exhausted, determined set of their jaws, in the way their eyes would meet across the clanking machinery in a moment of grim, unwavering understanding. Silas, however, did not wait for his deadline to expire. He began his campaign immediately, weaving his poison into the very fabric of Redemption Gulch. He was a master of manipulation, his approach both subtle and devastating. He bought influence not with overt bribes, but with gestures of friendship and promises of shared prosperity. He paid for a new sign for Henderson's store. He bought Sheriff Miller a fine new pistol, a gift from one man of the law to another. He listened to the town elders' complaints about the drought, nodding sympathetically and speaking of a future where water and money would flow freely. He presented himself as their champion, a benevolent force for progress in a land that had known only hardship. Once he had earned their trust, he began to casually drop his hints, planting the seeds of his lies in the fertile ground of their fear. He would be in the cantina, buying a round of drinks, and would sigh theatrically. "It is a tragedy, this drought," he would say, his voice laced with concern. "But sometimes a land is not the only thing that can be tainted." He would let the word hang in the air. When pressed, he would feign reluctance. "It is not my place to speak ill of a lady," he would begin. "But I knew Miss Ilara back in Boston, a terrible tragedy with her family, a scandal so profound she had to flee. One hates to be superstitious, but it seems trouble does follow some people." He expertly wove the lurid, twisted version of her story into the local legend of the Blackwood curse. He suggested that Caleb, in his grief and desperation, had been foolish. He had brought a tainted woman, a creature of ill fortune and dark secrets, onto an already cursed land. She was not a victim of the curse. She was its final, necessary ingredient. Her presence, Silas hinted darkly, was the very thing that kept the sky cloudless and the wells dry, dooming the entire valley to a slow and thirsty death. The town, already brittle from years of hardship and superstition, was ready to believe him. Their fear and desperation, which had simmered for years, needed a focal point, a scapegoat upon whom they could unleash their anger. Silas became their champion, the man who had the courage to speak the truth, and Ilara became the witch to be burned. The campaign reached its crescendo on the 6th night. Silas called a town meeting at the cantina. The room was packed, the air thick with the smell of sweat, cheap whiskey, and simmering resentment. Silas stood on a table, his handsome face flushed with passion, his voice ringing with self-righteous fury. He provided free whiskey, and as the men drank, their fear curdled into a dangerous, mob-like anger. "For months, you have watched your crops wither and your cattle die," he thundered, his voice carrying over the murmuring crowd. "You have prayed for rain, and the heavens have remained silent. You have blamed the land, you have blamed bad luck. But I am here to tell you, the source of your suffering is not under your feet, but living amongst you." He pointed a finger in the direction of the Blackwood Ranch. "Caleb Blackwood, in his foolishness, has brought the final piece of the curse into our midst. A woman of scandal and sin from the east, a woman who brought death upon her own family and fled the law. She is the blight, the ill omen that seals our fate. As long as she remains on that land, you will never see another drop of rain." His fiery rhetoric, fueled by the cheap liquor, whipped the crowd into a frenzy. Their faces, illuminated by the flickering lanterns, were masks of hatred. "What do we do?" a man shouted from the back. "For the good of the community," Silas declared, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial hiss. "The curse must be purged. We must reclaim that land and cleanse it." Sheriff Miller, his new pistol gleaming on his hip, stepped forward. "Silas is right," he announced, his voice slurring slightly. "As the law in this town, I am deputizing every able-bodied man here. We are going to see to some town justice." The mob roared its approval. They spilled out of the cantina, a chaotic and menacing river of men. They armed themselves with rifles, with shotguns, with pitchforks and axes from their wagons. Someone lit a torch, and then another, and another, until the single dusty street of Redemption Gulch was filled with the flickering, dancing light of their righteous fury. They began to march, a dark tide of anger rolling across the desert towards the Blackwood Ranch. Inside the small house, Ilara and Caleb heard them coming. First it was a low, distant rumble, a sound that might have been mistaken for thunder, but it grew steadily louder, resolving itself into the shouts of many angry men. Caleb went to the window, peering through a crack in the curtains. He turned back to Ilara, his face grim, the flickering torchlight reflecting in his weary eyes. "They're here," he said, his voice flat. Ilara's blood ran cold, but she felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. She had been running from this moment, from this kind of mob, for years. Now, it had finally found her in the middle of the desert. She and Caleb shared a look of grim, absolute understanding. There was no more running. This was the end of the line. Caleb moved to the mantelpiece and took down his old shotgun, the one he used for hunting rabbits. The irony was bitter. His father's fine rifle was gone, sold to pay for the machine that now sat silent in the yard. He broke the shotgun open, checking the shells with a steady hand. Ilara stood beside him, her face pale in the lamplight, but her jaw set with resolve. She would not cower. She would not weep. She would stand with him. It was then, in that moment of terrible, quiet resolve, that the darkest moment fell upon them. Outside, the drill rig, which had been hissing and chugging, let out a final, agonizing screech of tortured metal, and then sputtered into a deafening silence. Caleb's head snapped up, his eyes wide with a new kind of horror. He rushed outside, Ilara close behind him, in the flickering, menacing light of the approaching torches. They saw it. A plume of black smoke poured from the boiler, and a critical gear in the drilling mechanism had shattered, its teeth broken and mangled. The great iron drill bit was stuck fast, hundreds of feet deep in the unyielding earth. It was the moment of ultimate failure, their last hope. The machine for which they had sacrificed everything was dead. Just as the crushing weight of this final failure settled upon them, the mob arrived. They surrounded the small house, their angry shouts filling the air, the torchlight painting their faces in demonic shades of orange and black. "Blackwood, come on out," Sheriff Miller's voice boomed, full of false authority. "You and the woman, come out and face town justice. Surrender the property." Caleb looked at the broken machine, then at the ring of hateful faces surrounding them. He looked at Alara, her pale, determined face illuminated by the mob's torches. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Together, they walked up the steps and onto the small porch, standing side by side, defiant and cornered. They were ready to die here, on this patch of dust they had fought so hard for. Silas Blackwood pushed his way to the front of the crowd, a smug, triumphant smile on his face. He stepped forward, ready to savor his victory, to watch as the man he had swindled and the woman who had defied him were finally and completely broken. It was then that Alara found her voice. It was not the voice of a pleading victim, but of a woman with nothing left to lose. It was a voice as cold and clear as ice. "You are fools," she said, her voice cutting through the angry shouts, making them falter for a moment. "You have let this man poison you with lies. He doesn't care about you or your drought. He only wants what is under this land." The mob, recovering from their surprise, began to jeer and shout her down. "Lies! Witch! Get on with it! Sheriff!" They were unwilling to listen, their minds closed and sealed by fear and whiskey. At that precise, desperate moment, as Silas opened his mouth to deliver the final condemnation, it began. A low, deep rumble vibrated up from the ground beneath their feet. It was not thunder. It was a subterranean groan, a sound that seemed to come from the very bowels of the earth. The jeering stopped. The sound grew, becoming a powerful, groaning roar. All eyes, as one, turned from Alara and Caleb to the silent, broken drill rig. A trickle of black, viscous mud began to ooze from the borehole around the stuck drill bit. The trickle became a gurgling flow, and then, with a sudden explosive roar that shook the very air, it happened. A massive column of clear, fresh water erupted from the earth. The geyser shot 50, 60 feet into the night air. A powerful, living thing, a silver plume of impossible life against the dark sky. For a moment it hung there, a testament to all their desperate, hopeless work, before crashing down upon them. It rained down upon the stunned crowd, a torrent of clean, cold water. It drenched the sputtering torches, plunging the scene into a sudden, shocking darkness, lit only by the moonlight and the towering, impossible fountain. It washed the dust and sweat from their shocked faces. The breaking of the curse was not a whisper, it was a roar. The mob's fury evaporated instantly, washed away by the deluge, replaced by a slack-jawed, superstitious awe. They stood, soaked and silent, staring at the impossible fountain of water. Then they looked at Caleb and Alara. The two figures stood on the porch, drenched and dripping, silhouetted against the magnificent, thundering plume. In the pale moonlight, they no longer looked like cursed outcasts. They looked like figures from a legend, the prophets of a miracle. The geyser thundered, a constant, living roar that drowned out all other sound. It was the voice of the deep earth, a powerful rebuke to the years of silence and drought. The column of water, a shimmering silver pillar in the moonlight, continued to pour from the heavens it had created, soaking the parched earth and the silent, astonished crowd. Men who had come with torches and rifles now stood dripping and dumbfounded, their faces upturned, the cold, clean water washing away not just the dust of the trail but the very foundation of their prejudice. In the space of a single, impossible moment, Caleb Blackwood was transformed in their eyes. He was no longer the cursed pariah, the grim, stubborn fool who clung to a dead piece of land. He was a prophet. He was the man who, through sheer, bloody-minded will, had battled the earth and won. He had brought salvation to the valley. The whispers that now began to ripple through the stunned, soaked crowd were not of curses and ill omens, but of miracles. They looked from the impossible fountain of water to the tall, drenched figure on the porch, and they saw him for the first time not as a harbinger of death, but as the bringer of life. Into this stunned, reverent silence, Ilara stepped forward. She walked to the edge of the porch, her wet nightgown clinging to her, her face streaked with water and an unshakable resolve. Her voice, when she spoke, was no longer the trembling whisper of a frightened fugitive. It rang out with an undeniable authority, clear and strong, cutting through the roar of the geyser. She did not plead. She did not defend. She testified. "My name is Ilara," she began, her eyes sweeping over the crowd, meeting the gaze of Henderson, of the blacksmith, of the men who had jeered her moments before. "The man who brought you here tonight, Silas Blackwood, told you I was a curse. He is the only curse that has ever blighted this valley." She laid bare the entire truth, her words a sharp, clean blade slicing through the web of lies he had so carefully woven. She spoke of his predatory obsession in Boston, of a life of quiet respectability shattered by his refusal to accept her rejection. She told them of her beloved younger brother, James, a good and brave young man who had tried to protect her. Her voice choked for a moment, but she mastered it, the grief giving her strength. She described the confrontation, the shove, the carriage, and the way Silas had used his wealth and power to twist her brother's death into a weapon to destroy her reputation and drive her from her home. "He did not find me here by accident," she continued, her voice rising with a cold, clear anger. "He came here because his surveyors told him what my husband's heart already knew, that there was life deep within this land. He came here to steal this ranch, to take this water for himself. He used my past to manipulate you. He used your fear to turn you into his private army. Also, he could take everything from the one man who had the courage to fight for it. To prove her words, to give them a truth they could hold in their hands." She reached up and unclasped the silver locket from around her neck. "This was my brother, James," she said, her voice softening with a profound sorrow. She opened it, revealing the tiny, hand-painted miniature of a handsome young man with kind eyes. Then, from a small, waterproof pouch she had sewn into the seam of her dress, she produced the folded, yellowed letter, the last, damning, coercive letter from Silas she had been unable to bring herself to destroy. She did not read it aloud. She walked down the porch steps, her bare feet sinking into the new, soft mud, and walked directly to Henderson, the store owner, the man who had first greeted her with such contempt. She pressed the locket and the letter into his trembling, wet hand. In the eerie silence, broken only by the roar of the water, Henderson held the letter up to the moonlight. His face, already pale from shock, grew ashen as he read. The shame, the dawning horror, the full recognition of the truth, was plain for all to see. He looked up from the page, his eyes meeting Ilara's, and in his gaze was a profound and humbling apology. The town's awe turned in an instant to a cold and terrible fury, every eye in the crowd, no longer filled with superstitious fear, now fixed upon Silas Blackwood. He sputtered denials, his voice a panicked, reedy thing. "She is lying, a hysterical woman, she is twisting the truth." But his polished charm was gone, shattered. The handsome, benevolent investor had vanished, revealing the grasping, ugly, cowardly man beneath. The crowd closed in on him. Their faces, which had been turned against Caleb and Ilara moments before, were now a mask of unified contempt. Sheriff Miller, seeing his benefactor's swift and total fall from grace, quickly and quietly faded into the background, his new pistol suddenly seeming a very cheap price for his soul. There was no trial. There was no debate. The community, shamed by its own gullibility and enraged by the depth of the deception, delivered its own swift and brutal justice. Several of the larger ranchers seized Silas, their hands rough. They did not beat him, but they handled him with a cold, methodical contempt. They stripped him of his fine tweed coat and his wallet, emptying its contents onto the muddy ground. Then they marched him, sputtering and pleading, to the edge of the newly watered land. They threw him out into the desert, into the darkness from which he had come. One of the men tossed a single, half-full canteen of water after him. It landed in the dust at his feet, a final bitter mockery. "If you ever show your face in Redemption Gulch again," one of the old ranchers growled, his voice a low promise of violence, "you will be shot on sight." Then they turned their backs on him and walked away, leaving him to the mercy of the wilderness he had tried to conquer with lies. The seasons turned, and the land began to heal. The wild, thundering geyser, a symbol of nature's violent rebuke, was tamed, with the help of the humbled and grateful townspeople. Caleb engineered a system to cap the well, transforming the chaotic plume into a powerful, steady, and controllable source of life. He was no longer just a rancher. He was an engineer, a water finder, a man of quiet, practical wisdom. With his guidance, the community worked together as they never had before. Old feuds were forgotten in the shared labor of digging irrigation ditches, channeling the life-giving water from the Blackwood well to their own desperate farms. The valley began a slow, miraculous transformation. Fields that had been brown and cracked for a generation sprouted with the vibrant, impossible green of new corn and alfalfa. The skeletal cattle grew fat in pastures that were now thick and lush. The Blackwood Ranch, once the heart of a supposed curse, became the heart of this new and burgeoning prosperity. The scorched pasture that Alara and Caleb had fought so hard to save was the first to recover, and it became a lush, green meadow dotted with the gold of wild poppies. Their small, stark house, once a symbol of survival, became a home. It received a fresh coat of white paint, and the window boxes that Alara built with her own hands bloomed with bright red geraniums, a splash of defiant color and life against the vast desert landscape. Caleb and Alara were no longer outcasts. They were the respected and admired center of the community they had saved. The townspeople, their prejudice washed away by the miracle they had witnessed, made regular trips to the ranch. They came not with suspicion and whispers, but with gifts of freshly baked pies, with new tools, and with sincere offers of help. They came to Henderson, his face still etched with a quiet shame, bringing a bolt of fine blue calico for Alara. They came to ask Caleb's advice on digging their own wells, on rotating their new crops. They had learned a hard and humbling lesson about the poison of judgment and the blindness of fear. Caleb, once silent and isolated by his grief, found his voice. He became a leader, not through speeches or commands, but through his quiet competence and his deep, hard-won understanding of the land. The final scenes of their story were not written in fire or flood, but in the quiet, profound love that flourished in the healed valley. Their relationship was no longer defined by the desperate, frantic need for survival, but by a deep, peaceful, and abiding partnership. They were shown working side by side, their movements easy and familiar, a lifetime of communication passing between them in a shared glance. Their conversations, once clipped and utilitarian, were now filled with a warmth and gentle humor that would have been unimaginable in the silent, haunted house she had first entered. The ghosts of their pasts had not vanished entirely, but they had been laid to rest. They were no longer haunting specters that ruled their lives, but scars that spoke of their resilience, of the battles they had fought, and the victory they had won together. The story closes on a warm, golden evening, the kind of evening the valley had not known in a decade. The air was soft, filled with the sweet smell of damp earth and blooming flowers. Caleb and Alara were sitting together on their porch, in two sturdy rocking chairs he had built, looking out at the transformed landscape, a valley now green and shimmering and full of life under a sky streaked with the gentle colors of sunset. Alara was visibly pregnant, her body full with the promise of a new generation, her hand resting protectively on her swollen belly. Caleb, sitting beside her, reached over and placed his large, calloused hand over hers. His touch, which had once represented only hardship and a barren existence, The touch of a man who believed he was a curse was now the ultimate symbol of life, of love, and of redemption. They had gone deeper than the well, deeper than the rock. They had journeyed into the heart of their own pain, into the desolate wilderness of their own grief, and they had found not just water, but a love powerful enough to make the desert bloom. The curse was never in the land, it was in the loneliness of their hearts, and together they had broken it. Thank you for joining us around the campfire for this tale. We'd love for you to comment with where you are listening from to connect with fellow travelers. Subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.